She's lived too long, my daughter-in-law whispered beside my grandson's birthday cake, thinking I was too far away to hear her. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 72 years old, and until that afternoon, I still believed there were some lines family would never cross. The September sun hung low over Daniel's backyard in Westport, Connecticut, casting long golden shadows across the grass while children chased balloons near the white fence. Someone had hung blue streamers across the patio, and the smell of grilled hamburgers drifted through the cool air. It should have felt warm, familiar. The kind of Saturday afternoon I used to spend creating for everyone else. Instead, I stood there holding a paper plate with a slice of untouched cake while my daughter-in-law quietly discussed my existence like an inconvenience that had lasted too many years. Melissa stood near the gift table in a cream-colored sweater dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled despite the breeze, and she smiled the same polished smile she always used around guests. The smile that fooled everyone except me. Honestly, she murmured to one of her friends, lowering her voice as Ethan opened presents nearby, "She's lived too long. Daniel keeps dragging this out because he feels guilty." The other woman gave a nervous little laugh. "Melissa, what?" she whispered. "We all know it." I didn't move. Didn't react. Years ago, I might have dropped the plate or confronted her right there between the folding chairs and juice boxes. But age changes you. Not by making you weaker. By teaching you how much people reveal when they think you're no longer a threat. I slowly set the plate down beside the lemonade dispenser and looked toward my son. Daniel stood near the grill wearing the navy sweater I gave him last Christmas. He laughed at something his neighbor said, but his eyes flickered briefly toward Melissa. Then toward me. For one terrible second, I thought maybe he had heard her too. Maybe he would say something. Defend me. But he just looked away and flipped another burger onto the tray. That hurt more than her whisper ever could. Ethan suddenly ran across the patio toward me, his small sneakers flashing against the stone walkway. "Grandma," he shouted happily before wrapping his arms around my waist. I smiled immediately. Real smiles still came easily with him. "Hey there, birthday boy." He looked up at me with the same blue eyes Daniel had as a child. "Mom says you might move away soon." The words landed softly, quietly. Somehow that made them worse. "Did she?" I asked carefully. He nodded while licking frosting from his thumb. "She said old people get tired and need special places." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice gentle. "Well, I'm still here today." He seemed satisfied with that answer and ran back toward the bounce house while the adults laughed around him with plastic wine cups in their hands. I stood there alone beside the patio heater, suddenly feeling like a ghost at my own family gathering. No one had asked me to help plan Ethan's birthday this year. That had never happened before. For nearly a decade, I'd baked every cake myself. Chocolate dinosaur cakes. Superhero cupcakes. One year I spent 3 straight nights sewing a pirate tablecloth because Ethan loved treasure maps. Back then Melissa used to thank me constantly. "We couldn't do this without you, Evelyn." Funny how quickly gratitude disappears once people think they no longer need you. The wind picked up lightly, carrying the sound of laughter across the yard. Melissa walked past me then, holding a tray of wrapped cookies for the children. Her perfume lingered behind her. Expensive. Sharp. She paused just long enough to offer me one of those practice smiles. "Everything okay, Evelyn?" she asked sweetly. Evelyn. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Parker anymore. Just Evelyn. As if I were some distant neighbor who wandered into the wrong backyard barbecue. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Beautiful party." "Thank you," she said, adjusting her gold bracelet. "We wanted to keep things simple this year." Simple. That explained why my homemade decorations had never been unpacked from the box still sitting in my trunk. I'd spent all Thursday afternoon painting little baseball signs because Ethan loved the Yankees. Melissa texted me yesterday, saying they already had decorations covered. I should have understood then. Instead, I brought them anyway. Like an old fool still trying to matter. I watched Melissa walk back toward the guests, effortlessly stepping into the center of every conversation. People gravitated toward her naturally. She knew how to create that effect. She made everyone feel included while quietly pushing one person farther and farther outside the circle. And somehow, over the last 3 years, that person had become me. I glanced toward the large colonial house overlooking the yard. My house. Or at least it used to be. Richard and I bought that home 38 years ago when Daniel was still in middle school. I remembered painting those shutters pale blue one summer while Daniel rode his bicycle up and down the driveway. I remembered Christmas mornings beside that stone fireplace. Birthday dinners around the long oak table. Late nights waiting for Daniel to come home safely after prom. Every inch of that house carried pieces of my life inside it. But standing there that afternoon, listening to strangers laugh on the patio while my daughter-in-law quietly planned the final chapter of my existence, I realized something cold and frightening. Somewhere along the way, my family had stopped seeing me as the woman who built their world. I had become the last problem left to solve. I left shortly after the candles were blown out. Melissa barely noticed me gathering my cardigan from the back of the patio chair, but Ethan ran over at the last second and pressed a small paper goodie bag into my hands. "Do not forget your candy, Grandma," he said proudly, as if it were something important. I kissed the top of his head and told him I would save the chocolate for later. Daniel walked me to the driveway out of obligation more than affection. The late afternoon sky had turned pale gray, and dry leaves scraped softly across the pavement as we stood beside my Buick. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said while shoving his hands into the pockets of his jeans. "Mom." Not even a full conversation. Just 2 tired syllables dropped into the cold air because silence would have looked worse. "Of course," I answered. I would not miss Ethan's birthday. He nodded distractedly and glanced back toward the house where laughter spilled through the open patio doors. Melissa's voice carried above the others. Bright. Effortless. Perfectly at home. Daniel used to laugh like that around me once. Years ago, before marriage turned every family gathering into something carefully managed and emotionally measured. "Drive safe," he said. Then he hugged me quickly. One arm. Barely touching. The kind of hug people give distant coworkers at retirement parties. I drove home with the radio off. Connecticut roads always looked lonelier in early fall. Bare trees stretched over the highway while little clusters of antique shops and coffee houses blurred past my windows. The sun disappeared completely before I reached the house. My house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees Richard planted himself almost 30 years ago. He used to joke that by the time they grew tall enough to shade the driveway, we would finally be old. Back then old sounded peaceful. Not like this. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the silence. After a day spent surrounded by people pretending not to push me away, the quiet felt almost honest. I hung my coat carefully by the door and carried the untouched Yankees decorations from my trunk into the kitchen. The little paper baseballs bent slightly at the corners now. I set the box beside the counter and stared at it longer than I should have. Then I opened the refrigerator and saw the casserole dish I made for Daniel last Tuesday still sitting exactly where I left it. Unopened. Melissa once texted me 3 thank you messages because I brought homemade lasagna after Ethan had the flu. Now my cooking sat untouched behind almond milk and imported yogurt cups. I slowly closed the refrigerator door. Small things tell you the truth long before people do. I made tea and carried the mug into the living room where Richard's leather chair still faced the television exactly as he left it 2 years earlier. Sometimes I thought about moving it. Every widow probably reaches that moment eventually. But removing the chair felt too final, like admitting. The world had continued without asking my permission. I sat down on the sofa and glanced around the room. Family photos covered nearly every shelf. Daniel in his Little League uniform. Ethan in kindergarten. Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. Melissa smiling in expensive sweaters with one manicured hand resting possessively on Daniel's shoulder. At first, I blamed myself for the distance growing between us. That is what mothers do. We search ourselves before we question our children. Maybe I called too often. Maybe I offered too much advice after Richard died. Maybe grief had made me difficult to be around. But over the past year, little moments had started fitting together differently in my mind. Last Thanksgiving, Melissa changed dinner from my house to hers 3 days before the holiday because she said my kitchen was too stressful for everyone. At Christmas, Daniel forgot to invite me to Ethan's school concert until there was only one folding chair left in the back row near the exit. In June, Melissa laughed when I mentioned updating my will. Well, she said lightly while pouring wine, that will certainly make things easier for Daniel someday. Easier. Strange word choice. At the time I ignored it. Tonight I could not stop hearing it. My phone buzzed softly on the coffee table. A text from Melissa appeared on the screen. Thanks again for the baseball decorations idea. Maybe we can use them next year. I stared at the message for a long moment. Not thank you for coming. Not Ethan loved seeing you. Just another polite little sentence carefully arranged to sound kind enough if anyone else ever read it. Melissa had mastered that skill years ago. She never insulted directly in front of witnesses. She erased people gradually, quietly, one seat at a time, one forgotten invitation at a time, one sweet smile covering one cold intention. I set the phone face down and leaned back against the sofa. Outside, wind rattled the maple branches near the front porch. I suddenly remembered something Richard told me 6 months before he passed away. We had been sitting at this exact coffee table reviewing paperwork while rain tapped softly against the windows. If anything ever feels off after I am gone, he said carefully, promise me you will pay attention. At the time I thought he meant finances, taxes, investments. Richard always handled those things. But now, sitting alone in the dim glow of the living room lamp while my grandson's birthday balloon ribbon still clung to my sweater sleeve, I realized he may have been warning me about something else entirely. Something much colder. Something already quietly unfolding inside my own family. 3 days passed before I saw Daniel again. Tuesday mornings used to belong to us after Richard died. My son would stop by before work, drink coffee at the kitchen island, and pretend he was checking on me when we both understood he was really checking on himself. Grief made people selfish in strange ways. They needed reassurance that someone else was surviving so they could keep functioning too. But over the past year, those visits had become shorter, less frequent, easier to cancel. That Tuesday, he arrived 20 minutes late carrying a paper cup from some expensive coffee shop Melissa liked downtown. He kissed my cheek quickly before setting his keys on the counter. Traffic was terrible, he muttered. I nodded and poured coffee into Richard's old navy mug anyway. Daniel no longer drank homemade coffee when Melissa was around because she claimed caffeine upset his stomach, but he still accepted it here out of habit. Some parts of motherhood survive even when the warmth around them disappears. How is work? I asked while slicing banana bread. Busy. And Ethan? Good. The conversation dropped flat between us. I noticed Daniel checking his phone twice in less than a minute. Melissa's name flashed briefly across the screen before he turned it face down against the counter. Everything okay? I asked quietly. Yeah, Melissa is just dealing with contractors. Contractors. Another strange little detail that had started appearing lately. For months, Melissa talked constantly about renovations. Bigger kitchen. Expanded master suite. Updating the upstairs bathrooms. Always describing changes to a house that technically still belonged to me. That sounds expensive, I said carefully. Daniel shrugged. Property values are high right now. It makes sense to modernize things. Modernize. Another word people use when they want to erase history politely. I carried the banana bread to the table and sat across from him. For a few minutes, we ate in silence while soft rain tapped against the kitchen windows. Then Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, have you thought any more about simplifying things around here? There it was. The same cautious tone people use with fragile strangers. Simplifying? The house is large. A lot of upkeep. I looked around slowly. The blue ceramic bowl by the stove. Richard's reading glasses, still resting near the newspaper rack. The grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Every object carried decades inside it. I managed just fine. Sure, he said quickly. I just mean eventually. Eventually. That word lingered in the air like smoke. Melissa worries about you being here alone. I almost smiled at that. Melissa did not worry about me. Melissa worried about timing. Timing of inheritances. Timing of renovations. Timing of when an aging widow finally stopped being an obstacle standing inside valuable square footage. That is thoughtful of her, I replied evenly. Daniel looked relieved by my calmness. That was the thing about quiet women. People mistook silence for blindness. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered immediately. Hey, he said softly before walking toward the living room. I could still hear Melissa's voice faintly through the speaker. Sharp. Fast. Irritated about something. I gathered the plates slowly and carried them toward the sink without meaning to listen. Then Daniel said something that stopped me cold. No, she does not know anything. I froze beside the dishwasher. Silence followed. Then Melissa again. Too muffled to understand clearly. Daniel lowered his voice further. I said I will handle it. Handle what? My reflection stared back at me from the dark kitchen window. Pale face. Silver hair. Hands suddenly very still against the edge of the counter. A few seconds later, Daniel walked back in with an awkward smile that arrived too late to look natural. Sorry. Melissa is stressed. About the contractors? I asked softly. Yeah, among other things. He grabbed his coat sooner than usual after that. Barely touched the second piece of banana bread. Kept glancing toward the driveway, as if he needed to escape before some invisible pressure caught up with him. At the front door, he paused. Mom, if you ever needed extra support, you would tell me, right? Support? Just with the house. Or appointments. Things like that. There it was again. Not concern. Positioning. Careful emotional groundwork being laid brick by brick. I still drive myself to my appointments, Daniel. I know. He forced a smile. I am just trying to help. After he left, the house felt unusually cold despite the heat running softly through the vents. I wandered into Richard's study almost without thinking. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedarwood even after 2 years. Richard believed important things should always be written down somewhere safe. Insurance policies. Tax records. Investment notes. He trusted documents more than conversations because documents did not pretend. I sat down carefully in his leather desk chair and opened the bottom drawer where he kept household files. Most of it looked ordinary at first. Property taxes. Utility records. Trust paperwork I had never fully reviewed after his death because Daniel assured me everything was already organized. Then I noticed a sealed manila envelope tucked beneath a folder labeled Parker Family Estate. My name was written across the front in Richard's handwriting. Evelyn. Open only if something feels wrong. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. Even the grandfather clock downstairs sounded distant now. I stared at the envelope for a long moment while rain continued sliding softly against the windows outside. Then slowly, carefully, I reached for it. I did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, I sat there in Richard's study with it resting quietly in my lap while the rain darkened the windows around me. My husband had always believed that once certain truths entered a room, nothing ever felt quite the same again. Maybe that was why my hands trembled slightly as I traced the edge of the sealed paper with my thumb. Richard's handwriting looked steady as always. Calm. Careful. The same handwriting that filled anniversary cards and grocery lists and little notes he used to leave beside the coffee maker whenever he traveled for work. I suddenly remembered the last winter before his heart gave out. He had become quieter during those months. More observant. Sometimes I would catch him watching Daniel and Melissa across the dinner table with an expression I could not fully understand back then. Not anger. Not disappointment exactly. More like concern wrapped carefully inside silence. One evening after Christmas dinner, Melissa spent nearly an hour talking about real estate values in Fairfield County, while Daniel nodded beside her like a man too exhausted to disagree. Homes around here are practically gold mines now, she said while sipping wine near the fireplace. Especially properties with large lots. Richard glanced at me briefly over the rim of his glasses. A home is not a gold mine, he replied quietly. Not when people still live inside it. Melissa laughed lightly as though he had made a harmless joke, but I noticed how quickly her smile disappeared afterward. At the time, I ignored the tension because that is what women like me were trained to do. Keep peace. Smooth edges. Pretend discomfort was misunderstanding. Now those old memories returned differently. Sharper somehow. Like puzzle pieces finally locking into place after years of sitting scattered across a table. I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter and a business card attached with a paperclip. Harold Bennett, estate attorney. The same man who handled Richard's trust years ago. My stomach tightened immediately. Richard only involved Harold in serious matters. I unfolded the letter slowly. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something in this house no longer feels right to you. Trust that instinct. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe time is on their side. I paused there, staring at the sentence while rainwater slid quietly down the windows behind me. Richard continued in the same calm handwriting. Daniel has a good heart, but he confuses peace with weakness. And weakness attracts controlling people. I have updated certain protections within the family trust to ensure that no one can pressure you into decisions about this house, your finances, or your care. Harold understands everything. Speak only to him before signing anything. Anything. My chest tightened at that word. Had Richard already seen this coming before he died? Had he watched Melissa slowly positioning herself at the center of every family decision while Daniel drifted farther into passivity? I kept reading. If you ever begin feeling unwelcome in your own home, then I need you to remember something very clearly. This house was built around your life, not theirs. Do not let anyone make you feel temporary inside it. I lowered the letter slowly. Outside, thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the trees. The room suddenly felt smaller than before. Colder too. Not because of what the letter said, but because of what it confirmed. Richard had seen something I refused to see while he was alive. And he had been afraid enough to prepare for it privately. I picked up Harold Bennett's business card and turned it over carefully. His direct office number was written on the back in blue ink. Beneath it, Richard had added one final note in small handwriting. He already knows more than you think. I sat motionless for several minutes after that. My mind drifted back through dozens of moments I had dismissed over the years. Melissa insisting on attending every financial meeting after Richard's diagnosis. Daniel encouraging me not to worry about complicated paperwork. The subtle way conversation stopped whenever I entered a room too quietly. Even Ethan's innocent question at the birthday party now sounded less accidental. Children repeat what they hear. Somewhere inside that family, my future had already become a discussion. The realization settled heavily over me, but strangely, I did not cry. I thought I would. Women my age are expected to cry when their hearts finally break. Instead, I felt something colder. Clearer. Like fog lifting off dark water. My phone buzzed suddenly against the desk, pulling me from my thoughts. Melissa's name lit up the screen. Again. Forgot to mention. Daniel and I may stop by Saturday to discuss some things about the house. Nothing urgent. I read the message twice. Nothing urgent. People always say that right before they attempt something life-changing. I looked down at Richard's letter resting open beside the lamp. Then slowly, carefully, I reached for Harold Bennett's business card. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily across the maple trees while the grandfather clock downstairs marked each passing second with quiet precision. For the first time in months, maybe years, I no longer felt confused about what was happening around me. Hurt, yes. Lonely, absolutely. But not confused. And there is something dangerous about a woman who finally stops doubting what she already knows. Harold Bennett's office sat above a quiet insurance agency on Main Street in downtown Westport. The building smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee when I stepped out of the elevator Friday morning. Outside, the town looked exactly as it always had. Couples carried shopping bags past bakery windows. College students sat beneath striped umbrellas drinking iced coffee despite the chilly air. Everything appeared ordinary. That was the unsettling thing about betrayal. The world never changed around it. Only your understanding of the people inside it did. Harold greeted me personally before his receptionist could even stand. He looked older than I remembered. More silver in his hair. Thinner around the shoulders. But his eyes sharpened immediately when he saw the envelope tucked beneath my arm. "Evelyn," he said gently while shaking my hand. "I was wondering when I might hear from you." That sentence stayed with me as he led me into his office. Not if. When. Richard really had prepared him for this. The office walls were lined with dark wood shelves filled with leather-bound legal books no one probably opened anymore. Framed photos of Harold's grandchildren sat beside stacks of neatly labeled files. Everything in the room felt stable, organized, quietly trustworthy. I realized how long it had been since I felt that way around anyone. Harold waited until I sat before speaking again. You opened Richard's letter last night. He nodded slowly, almost sadly. Then I imagined certain things are starting to make more sense. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. Did Richard really believe Daniel and Melissa would try something? Harold leaned back carefully in his chair. Richard believed your son loved you. But he also believed Daniel avoided conflict so deeply that eventually someone stronger would begin making decisions for him. Melissa. Neither of us said her name immediately. We did not need to. Harold folded his hands together. About 8 months before Richard passed, he asked me to revise the family trust structure. Why? Because he noticed growing pressure surrounding the property. Property. Such a cold word for a home filled with 40 years of birthdays and Christmas mornings. Harold opened a folder on his desk and slid several papers toward me. Legally, this house remains entirely under your control for the duration of your lifetime. No sale, refinancing, transfer, renovation loan, or assisted living placement can occur without your direct written authorization and independent legal review. My eyes moved slowly across the paperwork. Every signature belonged to Richard. Every date carefully documented. Daniel told me everything was already arranged after the funeral, I said quietly. Harold gave me a long look before answering. I believe Daniel convinced himself he was simplifying things for you. Melissa. He stopped there carefully. Professional men like Harold rarely spoke directly about manipulative people. They preferred understatement. Melissa asked a surprising number of questions about asset transitions very early on. I remembered her standing beside Richard's hospital bed discussing kitchen countertops on Zillow while nurses adjusted medication nearby. At the time I thought she was trying to distract herself from grief. Now I wondered if she had already been calculating timelines. Harold continued. Richard instructed me to delay providing full trust details to Daniel unless you personally requested it. Why? Because he worried you might eventually be pressured emotionally. The room fell quiet after that. Outside the office window, a church bell rang somewhere down the street. 11 o'clock. I suddenly thought about Daniel as a little boy sitting beside me at the kitchen table doing homework while I packed his lunches for school trips. How did mothers ever prepare themselves for the moment their children stopped protecting them back? There is more, Harold said gently. He opened another folder. 3 months ago, Melissa contacted my office requesting information about long-term care transition procedures. I looked up sharply. Without speaking to me? Correct. My chest tightened slowly. What exactly did she ask? Harold adjusted his glasses. Whether cognitive decline evaluations could impact property management authority for elderly homeowners. The words settled over me like ice water. Cognitive decline. Elderly homeowners. Not Evelyn. Not mom. Just categories. Problems to organize. Did Daniel know? I whispered. Harold hesitated. That hesitation told me enough. I looked away toward the window before he could see the hurt fully settle across my face. Some pain arrives loudly. This kind arrives quietly, like a room slowly losing heat. Evelyn, Harold said carefully, nothing has been filed legally. No one currently has any authority over your finances or residence except you. But they were preparing. Yes. I stared down at the paperwork again. Suddenly dozens of strange moments over the past year transformed into something far more deliberate. Melissa insisting on accompanying me to doctor appointments. Daniel casually asking whether I still balanced my own checkbook. The repeated conversations about simplifying life. Easier options. Supportive communities. They had not been suggestions. They had been groundwork. Harold slid one final document across the desk. Richard also created a conditional clause regarding the house itself. Conditional. If any beneficiary attempts coercion, intimidation, or manipulation regarding your living arrangements, their inheritance rights become permanently restricted. I blinked slowly. Richard did that? Personally. A strange warmth moved through my chest then. Not relief exactly. Something steadier. The realization that my husband had seen me clearly even when I could not yet see the danger myself. Harold softened his voice. He loved you very much, Evelyn. I swallowed hard and nodded once. Then I carefully gathered the documents into my purse and stood. Outside the office, the afternoon sunlight had finally broken through the clouds, casting pale gold across Main Street. For the first time since Ethan's birthday party, I no longer felt like a confused old woman slowly losing her place in her own family. I felt like someone who had finally been handed the missing pages of a story everyone else thought she would never fully understand. Saturday arrived colder than expected. Wind rattled the maple branches outside the kitchen windows while I arranged a small tray of cinnamon cookies beside the coffee pot. Melissa always complimented those cookies in front of guests. Evelyn's secret recipe, she would say brightly, as though admiration cost her nothing. I wondered if she would still smile the same way after today. Daniel texted just before noon saying they were running 20 minutes late because Ethan had soccer practice. The old version of me would have spent those 20 minutes nervous, cleaning already spotless counters, rehearsing polite responses, searching for ways to avoid discomfort inside my own home. But something had shifted quietly after meeting Harold Bennett. Once you finally understand what people are trying to take from you, fear becomes strangely inefficient. I simply waited. The black folder Harold prepared sat neatly inside Richard's study upstairs. Not hidden. Not displayed either. Just ready. Around 12:30, Melissa's white SUV pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched her adjust her hair in the passenger mirror before stepping out. Even now, arriving for what was clearly an important conversation, she looked perfectly assembled. Camel-colored coat, tall leather boots, gold earrings that caught the pale sunlight. Melissa never allowed herself to appear unprepared. Daniel followed behind carrying Ethan's soccer bag while my grandson ran ahead toward the porch. "Grandma!" Ethan shouted the moment I opened the door. He hugged me tightly around the waist before rushing inside to look for snacks. Children still moved honestly through the world. That was what made them dangerous to manipulative adults. They noticed too much. "The house looks cozy," Melissa said while stepping inside. Her eyes scanned the entryway carefully. I noticed that now too. She always examined rooms the way realtors do, measuring spaces silently in her head. "Thank you," I replied calmly. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly before loosening his scarf. "Smells good in here. I made coffee." Melissa smiled politely. "Actually, I wanted tea if that is okay. Coffee has been making me anxious lately." Everything made Melissa anxious lately. Contractors, schedules, school registrations, market conditions, aging relatives. She carried anxiety like a designer accessory because it allowed her to control every room she entered. We settled around the kitchen island while Ethan disappeared upstairs searching for old board games. The house felt tense immediately despite the soft jazz playing from the living room speakers. Melissa stirred honey into her tea without drinking it. Daniel kept rubbing his wedding ring against his thumb. Finally, Melissa exchanged a quick glance with him before speaking. "Evelyn, we wanted to talk about some practical things." Practical. Another carefully chosen word. "Of course," I said evenly. "We have all been worried about you managing such a large property alone," she continued gently. "Especially with winter coming." Daniel nodded too quickly beside her. "The stairs alone can be difficult at your age." At your age. Funny how age only became important when people wanted something from you. "I manage the stairs just fine," I replied. Melissa leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice into that soft, sympathetic tone she used in public. "No one is saying you cannot. We just think there may be safer options moving forward." Safer options. Like I was a fragile package needing professional handling. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "There are some really beautiful communities nearby now, Mom. Places with activities and support." Communities. Support. The language of removal wrapped carefully inside. Concern. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. "You mean assisted living?" Silence flickered briefly across both their faces. Melissa recovered first. Only if you ever wanted it. Wanted it. As though these conversations had not already been happening behind closed doors for months. Upstairs, I heard Ethan laughing softly at something in one of the old toy boxes Richard kept in the guest room closet. The sound drifted down through the house like a memory from another life. Actually, Melissa continued carefully, we also wanted to discuss renovations long-term. Daniel and I have been thinking about what makes the most sense financially for the family. There it was at last. Not grief. Not concern. The house. Always the house. I looked directly at my son. And what exactly makes sense financially? Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, no one is trying to pressure you. Melissa touched his arm lightly before turning back toward me. We just think planning ahead prevents problems later. Planning ahead. Like discussing weather forecasts instead of a living woman's future. I set my teacup down quietly on the counter. Interesting, I said softly. Because Harold Bennett mentioned someone from this family already started planning ahead several months ago. The effect was immediate. Melissa's hand froze around her teacup. Daniel looked up sharply. You talked to Harold, he asked. Yesterday. A long silence settled across the kitchen. Outside, dead leaves scraped softly across the back patio. Melissa's expression remained composed, but only barely now. I did call his office once, she admitted carefully. Only because I worry about legal complications if something unexpected ever happens. Legal complications. Such cold language for discussing a widow, still sitting right in front of her. I studied her quietly for a moment. Then I stood. Excuse me, I said calmly. There is something upstairs I think both of you should see. Neither of them moved immediately. But I noticed the first real crack in Melissa's confidence as I walked toward Richard's study. Because for the first time since she entered this family, she no longer looked like the person controlling the conversation. Richard's study suddenly felt smaller, with all three of us inside it. The room had always belonged to quiet conversations and evening reading lamps, not tension thick enough to feel in the air. Daniel stood near the bookshelf with his arms folded tightly across his chest, while Melissa remained closer to the doorway, as though part of her already wanted an exit. I walked calmly to the desk and placed Harold Bennett's folder beside Richard's old brass lamp. No one spoke immediately. Downstairs, I could still hear Ethan moving game pieces across the dining room table, humming softly to himself. That ordinary little sound made the silence in the study feel even heavier. Mom, Daniel finally said carefully, what exactly did Harold tell you? I opened the folder slowly. Not dramatically. Just deliberately enough that both of them watched every movement. He explained the trust structure your father created before he died. Daniel's face tightened almost instantly. Melissa remained still, but I noticed her fingers curl lightly around the strap of her purse. There is no reason to make this adversarial, she said gently. Adversarial. Another polished word chosen to make me sound emotional before I had even raised my voice. I agree, I replied calmly. Which is why I wanted clarity. I slid the first document across the desk toward Daniel. He scanned the page quickly before looking up again. I already know about the trust. Not all of it, I said softly. That landed. Melissa stepped closer now, trying to read the paperwork from beside him. I continued before either of them could regain control of the conversation. Your father included specific legal protections regarding this house and my care arrangements. Daniel's jaw shifted slightly. Nervous habit. He inherited that from Richard. Mom, nobody is trying to take your house. No? I asked quietly. Then why was Melissa asking about cognitive evaluations and property authority 3 months ago? The room went still. Truly still this time. Melissa's expression changed first. Not guilt exactly. Irritation. Like someone frustrated a private conversation had become visible. Daniel turned toward her slowly. You told Harold that? Melissa lifted her chin defensively. I was gathering information. That does not mean anything. About what? I asked. About whether I was mentally stable enough to remain in my own home? That is not fair, she snapped before quickly softening her tone again. Evelyn, we have all been under stress since Richard passed. There it was again. Always redirecting. always smoothing sharp truths into vague emotional fog. But now that I could finally see the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. You started discussing assisted living before I ever needed help, I said evenly. You discussed renovations to a home that does not belong to you. And somehow my age only became a concern after property values increased. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. Mom, please. No, I replied quietly. Please do not ask me to pretend anymore. The words hung heavily between us. Melissa crossed her arms now, abandoning some of the sweetness she normally wore like armor. You are making assumptions. I looked directly at her. Am I? For the first time since joining this family, Melissa looked uncertain around me. Not frightened. Melissa was not the type to frighten easily, but uncertain. Because manipulative people depend on confusion to survive, and mine was disappearing quickly now. I opened the final document inside Harold's folder and placed it carefully on the desk. Your father also added a conditional clause, I told Daniel. Any beneficiary who attempts coercion regarding my residence or financial decisions permanently restricts their inheritance rights. Daniel stared down at the paper without speaking. Beside him, Melissa's face lost color almost instantly. Small changes reveal the biggest emotions. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. Her breathing slowed. She understood the document immediately. Richard did not trust us? Daniel asked quietly. The sadness in his voice almost broke my heart. Almost. Your father trusted me, I answered softly. Enough to protect me. No one spoke after that. Outside the study windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the backyard where Daniel once played catch with Richard every summer evening after dinner. I suddenly remembered standing at this same window 20 years earlier watching my husband teach our son how to throw a baseball properly. Richard always said Daniel was too gentle for his own good. The world loves gentle men, he told me once. But controlling people love them even more. I finally understood what he meant. Downstairs, Ethan suddenly called out loudly from the dining room. Grandma, where is the blue Monopoly piece? His innocent voice cut straight through the tension. I smiled before answering. Top drawer beside the fireplace, sweetheart. Silence returned after that, but something fundamental had shifted now. Daniel looked exhausted. Melissa looked cornered. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible inside my own family. Melissa straightened slowly before reaching for her coat. I think maybe this conversation has become emotional, she said coolly. Emotional. Funny word coming from the woman who had spent months quietly building a future around my absence. I closed the folder gently and met her eyes. No, I said calmly. It has finally become honest. Melissa left first. She called for Ethan in a voice so tightly controlled that even my grandson looked confused when he came running into the hallway holding the blue Monopoly piece in his hand. Already, he asked while glancing between the adults. But Grandma said she would play with me. Another time, sweetheart, Melissa replied quickly while helping him into his jacket. Her smile had returned, but it looked thinner now. Forced around the edges. Daniel lingered behind near the staircase after they moved toward the front door. For a moment, he looked less like a 43-year-old man and more like the uncertain teenager who used to stand outside the principal's office after getting caught skipping math class. Mom, he said quietly once Melissa stepped outside with Ethan. I did not know about most of that. I studied his face carefully. The exhaustion there was real. So was the guilt. But guilt without action eventually becomes its own kind of betrayal. You knew enough, I answered softly. His eyes dropped toward the hardwood floor. Melissa worries about everything. Sometimes she goes too far trying to plan ahead. Plan ahead. There were those words again. As if discussing the possibility of removing me from my own life was simply another household project beside refinancing or landscaping. And what do you want, Daniel? I asked. He looked up slowly. Truly looked at me for the first time in months. I want everyone to stop fighting. I almost smiled then. Not because it was funny. Because it was painfully predictable. Daniel had spent his entire life confusing peace with fairness. As long as no one raised their voice, he believed situations remained harmless. Even when someone was quietly being erased right in front of him. There was never a fight until I stopped staying silent, I replied. He opened his mouth as though to respond, but Ethan suddenly called impatiently from outside the front door. Melissa did not come back in after him. She stayed in the SUV with the engine running. Daniel sighed softly before reaching for his coat. I will call you tomorrow. Take care driving home, I said politely. He hesitated 1 second longer. Then he left. I watched through the front window as Melissa spoke rapidly the moment he entered the passenger seat. Daniel stared straight ahead while she talked, gripping the steering wheel without moving. Even from inside the house, I could recognize the shape of a marriage built around one person constantly directing the emotional temperature of the other. The SUV disappeared down the street moments later, leaving the neighborhood strangely quiet beneath the fading orange light of early evening. I locked the front door slowly and leaned against it for a moment. My entire body felt tired now. Not weak. Just tired in the way people become after finally carrying emotional weight they have ignored for too long. I wandered back into the kitchen and noticed 3 untouched cinnamon cookies still sitting on Melissa's plate beside the teacup. That small detail almost made me laugh. Melissa never left food behind. Richard used to joke that she approached dessert with the determination of a corporate attorney. Tonight she had been too distracted to eat. I cleaned the kitchen slowly while darkness settled outside the windows. Every movement felt oddly calm. No shaking hands. No tears. Just clarity. I finally understood why Richard always organized paperwork so carefully after receiving his diagnosis. He was trying to leave me something stronger than money. Preparation. Protection. Permission to trust myself. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. I think today became unnecessarily upsetting for everyone. Maybe some space would help before more misunderstandings happen. Misunderstandings. Such a graceful little word for manipulation exposed under direct light. A second message appeared almost immediately afterward. Daniel is overwhelmed. That one I believed. Daniel probably was overwhelmed. Weak men often become overwhelmed when the women in their lives stop quietly absorbing tension for them. I set the phone aside without responding and carried a cup of chamomile tea into the living room. The house felt different tonight. Not emptier. Stronger somehow. Like an old tree after a storm finally reveals which branches were already rotten. I sat down beside the fireplace and looked around at the photographs lining the shelves. Richard holding newborn Daniel in a hospital blanket. Ethan sitting on my lap during his first Christmas. Vacation pictures from Cape Cod summers long before Melissa entered our lives with her polished smiles and carefully managed narratives. Families always think collapse happens suddenly. One explosive argument. One dramatic betrayal. But that is not how most homes break apart. Usually it happens quietly. Through accumulated dismissals. Tiny humiliations. Conversations held just out of hearing range. Love slowly replaced by management. Respect replaced by tolerance. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times through the hallway. I closed my eyes briefly and listened to the familiar sound echo through the house Richard built with his own hands. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 6 months before he died, Richard stood beside this same fireplace watching Daniel and Melissa argue softly in the kitchen during Thanksgiving cleanup. Do you know what scares me most? He asked quietly after they walked outside. Not that someone might manipulate Daniel. That someone might eventually convince you to apologize for noticing it. At the time I dismissed the comment because I did not want to believe my husband saw danger where I still saw family. Tonight I finally understood exactly what he meant. And for the first time since becoming a widow, I no longer felt like a woman desperately trying to hold her family together. I felt like the last person in this house finally willing to tell the truth about what it had become. The following week passed with unusual quiet. No cheerful texts from Melissa. No quick stop-ins from Daniel pretending he happened to be in the neighborhood. Even Ethan's nightly video calls suddenly became less frequent. Silence can reveal just as much as cruelty once you know how to listen for it. I spent those days moving through the house differently. Slower. More intentionally. I opened windows despite the cold October air and let sunlight reach corners that had stayed dim since Richard died. I cleaned out drawers. Reorganized shelves. Not because I planned on leaving, but because for the first time in years, the house felt fully mine again. Thursday morning, Harold Bennett called while I was trimming dead roses near the front walkway. "I thought you should know," he said carefully after I answered. "Melissa contacted my office again." I straightened slowly, gardening gloves still covered in dirt. "About what?" "She requested clarification regarding beneficiary conditions." Of course she did. Melissa had probably spent the entire week trying to determine whether Richard's protections were real or simply legal intimidation. And I informed her that the conditions are fully enforceable. I looked out across the yard where dry leaves drifted across the driveway in soft circles. How did she respond? Harold paused briefly. Not well. After we hung up, I stood there quietly for a long moment beneath the maple trees. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I mostly felt sad. Not because Melissa had been exposed. Because somewhere inside all this manipulation and planning and emotional pressure, my family had stopped behaving like family long before I noticed it. That evening, Daniel finally called. His voice sounded tired immediately. "Mom, can we talk?" "We're talking." A long sigh came through the phone. "Melissa feels like you do not trust her." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Daniel, your wife explored legal pathways for removing authority over my home before I even needed assistance. She was trying to plan responsibly." "No," I said calmly. "She was trying to position herself." Silence followed. Heavy. Defensive. Familiar. Then Daniel lowered his voice. "Things have been difficult this week." Difficult. Another vague word hiding concrete truths underneath it. "I imagine they have." Melissa thinks Harold made everything sound harsher than it was. Did he invent the phone calls? Daniel did not answer immediately. Somewhere in the background, I heard cabinet doors shutting softly. Their kitchen. Their tense little kingdom built on avoiding direct honesty. "She worries about security," he finally muttered. "For Ethan. For the future." "And what about my future?" I asked quietly. That question sat between us longer than anything else I had said. Daniel had no immediate answer because people like Melissa train others to prioritize their anxieties first. Slowly. Constantly. Until everyone else's humanity becomes secondary to maintaining their emotional comfort. "Mom," he said at last, "nobody wanted to hurt you. Intentions do not erase behavior." Another silence. Then finally, softly, "I should have paid more attention." That one was honest. Maybe the first completely honest thing Daniel had said in months. I closed my eyes briefly and leaned back against the porch railing. "Yes," I replied. "You should have." After we hung up, I made soup for dinner and carried the bowl into the living room where rain tapped softly against the windows again. Connecticut autumn always smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet leaves after dark. Richard loved this season. He used to claim the world became more truthful once summer decorations disappeared. Nothing left to hide behind. Around 8:30, headlights swept across the front curtains. Unexpectedly. I frowned slightly before setting down my spoon. Melissa's SUV sat at the curb alone this time. No Daniel. No Ethan. Just her. She stepped out wearing a long gray coat with her hair pulled tightly back, and for once she looked less polished than usual. Tired around the eyes. Frustrated. Human almost. I opened the door before she knocked. For a second, neither of us spoke. Cold wind drifted between us through the porch light glow. "May I come in?" she asked finally. I stepped aside without answering. Melissa walked slowly into the living room and glanced around the house carefully, almost like she was seeing it properly for the first time. The family photographs. Richard's chair. Ethan's old art projects still taped beside the hallway. Evidence of an actual life instead of simply valuable property. "Daniel does not know I came," she admitted quietly. I assumed. She stood near the fireplace with both hands wrapped tightly around her purse strap. Then finally she looked directly at me. "You think I am some terrible person." I studied her calmly. "I think you became very comfortable imagining a future where my voice mattered less and less." Her eyes flickered away first. "That is not fair. Neither is slowly treating someone like they are already disappearing." The room fell silent again except for rain against the windows. Melissa looked exhausted suddenly. Not defeated. Just exposed. There is a difference. After a long moment, she spoke so quietly I almost missed it. You do not understand how much pressure Daniel feels all the time. I thought about my son sitting silently at kitchen counters for years, while stronger personalities shaped the emotional rules around him. Then I looked back at the woman standing inside my living room. No, I said softly. I understand perfectly now.